Hey everyone, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks whether we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who thinks Reese's Cups are a little bit mid, but literally. In today's episode, I discuss proxy-based direct democracy, which is a way of reforming local government to make it directly democratic and thus more accountable, while also responding to some of the pragmatic challenges that direct democracy presents. It's the latest in my ongoing series of ideas about how to change America's political system by giving local governments more authority, a theory I'm calling localism. Let's jump right in. So you might remember that 2 episodes ago, I tried to paint this everyday picture of what political life in a localist America could look like. Part of that picture was talking about the whole local preemption of state laws piece and what the kinds of things that a community might pass laws on could be. But the other half of that picture was discussing, in probably a bit too much detail, sorry about that, this system of voting that I called proxy-based direct democracy. The basic idea of this system was that local government operated along directly democratic lines, meaning that laws were passed on a one-person, one-vote basis where the entire public would have the opportunity to vote on a law. But in addition to being able to cast that vote directly, community members could also opt to delegate their vote to someone else, also known as a proxy. This proxy's vote would then count for 2, the proxy's own vote plus the vote he was delegated. A community member could delegate a proxy their vote at any time, and can also remove that authorization at any time. And a proxy can serve as the proxy for lots of people at once. So, for example, a proxy could theoretically have her vote count as 100 if 99 people delegated her their vote. And when you heard all this, you're probably like, gee, thanks for explaining that kind of convoluted system, I guess, but why the hell would we want that to be how votes are cast in our community? You're already trying to get us on board with this harebrained idea of turning America upside down and making local law have preemptive power over other levels of law. Why would we also want to do this crazy thing that injects even more change into what is already a lot of change in a very short time? For that matter, there isn't really a single part of the American government that's directly democratic. Why would we want to break away from our normal practices and embrace a form of government we've historically rejected? Well, I do think I have answers to all of those questions, and I'd like to believe they're convincing. But before I can get into those answers, I have to start by talking about a serious problem. And this is not just a problem with some hypothetical localist government in the future. This is a problem with local governments today, right now, how they currently work. Thus far, I've kind of painted this rosy picture of local government as this close, accountable form of government where, in contrast to state and federal government, individual action and individual agency matter a lot. And I really do think that's true. But I'd be foolish to close my eyes and pretend that there aren't a bunch of really harmful dynamics that are at play in your average local government. Here's one such dynamic. Whose voices get heard by the local government? Who are the ones that have their complaints taken care of, whose opinions matter, whose interests are protected? Well, I think the answer is going to be pretty different in a lot of communities, but I can tell you what the answer is in my community, which may or may not reflect how yours works, but I think there's a lot of communities that have a similar dynamic. So the people who have the ear of the city council in my community are wealthy, home-owning retirees. Yep. If you show up to a council meeting, I'd say 80% of the people there at any given session are in their 60s or over, own a house, and have a whole lot more money than the average person in the community. The city's lawmaking always inevitably revolves around the opinions and outrages and financial interests of this class of comparatively well-off retirees. And to an extent, that's the system working as intended. These people make their voices heard, and the city council listens. If my city was full of nothing but homeowning retirees, then the local government would be doing a great job of representing the popular will. But here's the trouble. My city is not made up of only well-off homeowners. In fact, most people where I live don't own their home. They are from a different generation, both older and younger, and often from a different economic background than these wealthy retirees. At the end of the day, the we own our home and have a good chunk of money and were born in the 50s crowd is actually a pretty small piece of the pie in my city, so to speak. But that tiny piece of the pie is still the one that my local government gives most or all of its attention to. The result is that local laws and local actions often benefit this privileged retiree minority while ignoring or outright harming everyone else. Not always, to be clear. There are times where other groups can effectively organize to work against or with the dominant retiree group to get things done and to bend the ear of the local government. And whatever the faults of this dynamic, at least the well-off retirees are actually people who live in our community, rather than some group of people who live hundreds or thousands of miles away in another state and nevertheless try to dictate what should go on in my town. Still, most of the time, the local government is listening to only a subset of the public rather than the public as a whole. This is not a representative, accountable, or fair way to govern. Maybe things are a bit different, a bit better, a bit worse in your community. But for a lot of places in America, and I bet there's a decent chance that includes your locality, wherever that might be, wealthier people who own homes are the only ones that local government listens to is an all too familiar reality. And let me be clear about the stakes here. I'm advocating for us to devolve pretty much all lawmaking authority to local governments as a part of the localist vision. That is a huge increase in the power of local governments across America. If we keep local governments exactly the way they are, if we don't take a hard look at the things that make them unjust and address them before we hand them all this extra power, then we stand a huge risk of creating a new system of government that just reproduces all the evils of the current American system. We might even make a government that is worse than the one we share now. So we have to address the fact that many or most local governments are doing a poor job of representing the will of their communities. Otherwise, what are we even trying to achieve? So why is it that this wealthy retiree subclass generally gets to have all this extra political agency and sway? Why do towns across America listen to a small number of comparatively wealthy people while just paying lip service to everyone else? My pitch is that it's because of two reasons: who shows up and who votes. By who shows up, I mean who in the community has the time, interest, and will to actively engage with the various kinds of public participation that are available for community members to use to engage with their local government. This is stuff like sending letters to city council, attending local government meetings, writing editorials for the paper, providing feedback on a local government proposal, organizing letter writing campaigns, stuff like that. The people in the well-off retiree demographic do all of that stuff at a higher rate. They are the squeaky wheels, and as a result, they get most of the grease. Why is it that people from the well-to-do retiree crowd tend to be the ones who are able to participate the most in local government? It's a combination of factors. Let's start with the obvious, which is that they don't work, or at least they don't work as often as people who aren't retired. To be clear, that is not a dig at retirees, and I am not digging at retirees at all for trying to make their voices heard in their community. It's great they've reached a point in their lives where labor becomes a choice rather than necessity. I hope all of us get to enjoy that someday. But retirement, and having enough money to own a house, means you do have a lot more time on your hands than people who still have a work week. So you can do stuff like go to an evening town council meeting, or write a newspaper editorial, or meet with other like-minded retirees to plan letter writing campaigns. These are just hours in the day that people who are younger or older and less wealthy simply don't have. So it's just natural that lots of local political spaces will be dominated by the subset of the community that doesn't have to deal with a 9-to-5. Relatedly, people who are retirement age are less likely to have kids who still live with them. Less likely here doing a lot of work. Lots of retirees still have kids with them because we're facing a pretty tough economy. And again, this is not a dig at anyone who that's what their family arrangement looks like. I'm just saying it's less likely. This means that they often have more time on their hands than parents who spend most of the day taking care of their children. Again, speaking anecdotally, parents with kids in school are probably one of the more politically active and powerful groups in local government. So it's not like they're never around or never participating. But when you're having to look after your family and you just don't have as much time as someone in their 60s or 70s whose kids moved out 10 years ago, you just won't have as much capacity to participate in the various forms of public participation that then bend local government's ear. So the first reason this wealthy retiree subset shows up more than other parts of the community is just that it has more time than most other groups. I think that's a pretty quantifiable factor. But I do also think there's a qualitative, more squishy vibes-based factor at play here, which is just that people born in the generation currently occupying the retiree demographic value civic participation more highly than those from younger generations. This isn't me insulting the youth. They have very fair reasons for being jaded about public participation and skeptical that their actions could actually make a difference. It's just an observation that retirement-age people have more faith in the political process and more of a sense that getting involved at the local level is part of their duty as citizens. Now, part of the reason that instinct exists is because it's been reinforced. Retirees have more time to speak out Because they want time to speak out, City Council listens, City Council acts, the retiree subset sees their efforts rewarded, and therefore wealthy retirees gain more confidence that local government is fair and responsive, leading them to consider public participation as more worthwhile. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Okay, so more time plus more faith in the process equals more participation, which leads to more attention from the political electeds. That's the who shows up half. What about the who votes half? By who votes, I mean literally like who votes in like local elections, which as it turns out is almost nobody. Seriously. Like many urban areas, my town is solidly Democrat. So the Democratic primary is often in practice the only election that really matters for city council. The actual election for city council that happens on election day is usually just a formality. Whatever candidates won in the Democratic primary are the ones who almost always, in the vast majority of the time, win the entire election. Given that, you can see how the Dem primary is pretty important. In practice, it's the real election. In a town of mostly Dems, about what percent of registered voters would you guess showed up to vote in the Dem primary for city council? 40%? 30%? Nope. Only about 15% of registered voters voted. That's like one person out of every 10 people who live in the city voting in the election that, in practice, will determine who the city councilors are going to be. Now, that's pretty bad. I'm sure there are some localities that have a much better rate of participation and some localities that have a much worse rate of participation. Not to go on a tangent, but even if you think this whole idea of localist reform is bogus at best and idiocy at worst, I hope I can convince you to please go out and vote in your local elections. City Council or the County Board of Commissioners or whatever your local legislators are called make some of the most impactful decisions affecting what goes on in your life. These are the people who keep the roads in good or bad shape, create parks for your kids to play in, decide how much money is going to schools, set your property tax rate, approve new development, make sure the trash gets picked up on time, manage emergency services, and a whole bunch else. And unlike federal or even statewide elections where voting really doesn't make that much of a difference, sorry, that's just kind of the hard numerical truth, the turnout for local government elections and your state representatives is genuinely so awful that if you show up to vote, your one vote can have an outsized impact. That impact gets even higher if you can convince like 2 or 3 of your friends to show up and vote too. Voting in local elections may just be the single most powerful way for you to exercise your political agency in the current American system of government. And that's not just a do your civic duty, empty slogan, middle school, I voted sticker kind of thing. I'm serious. Look at the numbers for turnout in your last local election, and I am confident you'll see that I'm right. That you going out and voting would make a powerful, quantifiable difference. Anyway, tangent over. So turnout in local elections is super duper bad, but in that small sliver of voters who do turn out, guess what group is overrepresented? Yep, our old friends, the home-owning, well-to-do retirees. That subset of the community votes at a disproportionate rate. Accordingly, any career politician in the local government who is hoping to get more votes than their rivals is going to pay special attention to anything that home-owning retirees ask for. Make that group mad, and a city council member is liable to be out of a job after the next election. So why do well-to-do retirees vote more than other parts of the community? Largely, it's just because of the same factors that lead them to be more active in local politics more generally, the factors that we just discussed. It's more likely to be less burdensome for a retiree to spend time on a weekday standing in line to vote than it would be for, say, someone who works a job and is behind on rent and needs every penny of their paycheck. Well-off retirees don't have to go to a job or look after kids or otherwise tackle the kinds of things that get in the way of other people voting. They're also still young enough that they can probably drive or walk themselves to a polling place and spend a few hours in line, both actions that a more elderly person might find difficult. Aside from having less barriers to voting, wealthy retirees are already likely to be more engaged in community political actions and more likely to be participating in local government, and thus will be more motivated to reinforce those activities by voting in a local election. And because they often see their efforts rewarded, well-off retirees are more likely to consider local political action as effective, meaning they see voting as a viable way to achieve their political objectives in the community. Finally, my completely unfounded, but genuine take, is that there's just a certain kind of participatory ethos that's rooted in prior generations that, through no fault necessarily of their own, younger generations don't possess. So retirees feel a greater responsibility or duty to vote in local elections than others might. But separately, I think the reason that a lot of people don't vote in local elections is because there is a somewhat correct feeling that local elections just don't have a lot of oomph behind them. When your local government's laws can get run over by both the state and federal government, why bother focusing your limited time and energy to local political participation when it's the stuff happening elsewhere that has decisive authority? Sure, maybe if you're in the retiree subset that sees outsized success in local matters, maybe it's still worth it to you to make the trek out to vote in local elections. But if you're literally anyone else, it sort of makes more sense to come to vote for your representatives in state and federal Congress that are making these huge, provocative decisions about hot-button items like military involvement, income taxes, healthcare, federal spending, etc. Again, I'm showing my biases here, not like I don't show my biases all the time, but my suspicion is that if local governments were given more authority and autonomy, if local governments were allowed to make more impactful decisions and legislate in more areas, then we'd see participation pick up, because people would surmise that it's now more important to have a say in local matters. Anyway, that's just my take. When candidates for local government run as part of an election, they, or more accurately, the political parties backing and funding them, have no choice but to zero in on these realities. The wealthy retirees are the ones who vote, so a career politician cannot afford to advocate for policies that would be good for the community as a whole, but bad for the wealthy retiree subset. And because wealthy retirees show up, they're the ones who control the public narrative about how good of a job a local politician is doing, which of course factors into whether or not that politician will get reelected, and that in turn determines whether or not the politician's political party of choice will continue to control what happens in your community. So the politicians spend all their time chasing votes from the wealthy retiree group, and damn what happens to anyone else. And this unfair and unrepresentative behavior from local governments will continue unless the toxicity that gives rise to it is removed. That toxicity is not, to be clear, not the heightened participation of the wealthy retiree subset who are just exercising their right to have their voices heard as part of the community. I want to be clear, again, I am not blaming folks who are wealthy retirees who happen to own their homes for going out and doing a good job of advocating for themselves. That is your right, and even your privilege, as someone who lives in a local government and can go and be a part of participatory government. I'm not trying to say we should be demonizing those people who are effectively making their voices heard. What I'm saying is that the dynamics that make their voices exclusively heard, the systemic issues that elevate their voices above others, are things that we need to address. So what are those systemic issues? Well, it's Republican-based governance. That's small r Republican. It's party politics. It's the procedures that make it so a group of 5 or 7 people make all the decisions for everyone in the community, and those 7 people get their positions via the maneuverings and decisions of national political parties. If there was a way to, 1, make it so national political parties were no longer kingmakers who get to handpick who exercises power in the community, and 2, make it more possible for everyone in the community to participate in the mechanics of local government rather than a privileged subset of voters, then we could stop this bad trend of local governments that cater to a few well-off people rather than the community as a whole. This is where direct democracy first enters the picture. Direct democracy neatly achieves the first half of that two-part solution I just outlined. It removes determinative power from the hands of national political parties and places it directly, immediately in the hands of all community members. When it's the people who are making the decisions on a one-person, one-vote basis, then the national political party ceases to have control over the ones who are in charge of the local government's affairs. After all, voters in a direct democracy do not need to run in elections. They do not need to kowtow to a subset of citizens in order to continue to have a say in lawmaking. They simply weigh laws as they arise and then cast a vote in accordance with their own judgment. That right to vote is inherent to community membership, to being a part of the locality that the local government governs. So, unlike an electoral candidate, you don't need to go out and win the approval of a national party to fund your election before you can get your hands on the levers of power. In a direct democracy, your hands are always on the levers of power. There is no way to gate you from them. And because the way national political parties exert control over local governments is via gating, either by withholding funds from a candidate or spending them on a rival, they cease to have controlling power over the decision makers in a direct democracy. But where direct democracy falls short is in achieving the second half of the two-part solution, i.e. in making it more possible for the community as a whole to participate in the decisions of local government rather than a privileged subset. Now, it's true that by making it so everyone from the poorest to the richest gets one vote and can cast that vote however you please on all matters of government rather than just a once every 4 years election, direct democracy theoretically presents a much more level playing field compared to a small r Republican local government. But that's the thing. The one person, one vote equality only has teeth if everybody has the equal ability to cast their vote. And simply transferring over to a direct democracy does not suddenly make everybody available to attend hours of city meetings every week. It will still be the wealthy retirees, those with enough money and time and health and energy to dedicate significant amounts of their lives towards local politics, who will have the most capacity to show up to cast their directly democratic vote. The end result? Direct democracy might risk entrenching the control of a privileged few over the community rather than ameliorate it. And separate from that, what about people who are elderly or physically disabled or chronically ill? Should we lose the benefit of their voices and their values just because they have challenges with being physically present to cast votes? Of course not. Direct democracy just kind of assumes that everyone is equally capable of attending public events, staying up late during debate sessions, spending time on research, and physically reaching town hall. That's simply untrue, and that's a serious flaw with direct democracy. This issue of, I guess what you could call availability, is actually one of the best arguments in favor of small r republicanism. Now, in reality, the reason we have a republic rather than a democracy is because at the nation's founding, and a lot of states' foundings, a bunch of old rich dudes got together and said, average Joes are too stupid to know what's good for them, so let's make sure men of decent standing and breeding are the ones calling the shots rather than the unwashed horde. I'm paraphrasing with that, but the sentiment is definitely there, and more on that in the next episode. But let's pretend that instead of this being the reason, our founding fathers offered this rationale. Direct democracy is nice in theory, but it just has too many practical problems to actually be executed in practice as a functioning governing system. What, you're going to stuff all of New York into a town hall and try and run a legislative session? You expect Grandma, who's sharp as a nail but blind as a bat, to be able to drive down to town hall every weekend to vote on laws? Obviously not. So instead of making everyone go through the trouble of getting together once a week or more to go over hours of legislative stuff, we should just pick a couple of people and make passing and rescinding laws their full-time job. They'll be public servants like firefighters or teachers, and their social role will be to handle governmental things while the rest of us go to work and sleep and eat and spend time on less boring stuff. They are dedicated to honestly representing the interests of the community, big if, but still, then for all intents and purposes, they are the collective voice of the city. They are Grandma. So the government reflects the popular will and consent of the governed, and we don't have to dedicate a quarter of our lives to sitting in town halls all the time. And there's no way around it. This is a very powerful argument. We're all busy. We all have better things to do than trek out to City Hall and fight with our neighbors over a budget item. Needing to cast a vote on 10 or 15 or 100 laws per week, every week, for the rest of our lives is incredibly daunting. Wouldn't it be both more convenient and more fair for those of us with special needs if we just chose a subset of community members to take care of the shit while the rest of us live our lives? But that just leads us back to small r republicanism, and we all live the consequences of that republicanism every day. No voice in our local government save for an election or two every decade, and clear favoritism on the part of local government for a privileged subset of community members. If only there was some way to combine the equality and directness of small d democracy with the convenience and practicality of small r republicanism. And at last, this is where we get to the proxy-based half of proxy-based direct democracy. To explain why I think a proxy system is a way to make direct democracy more practical, we have to look at an unexpected setting. Hold your nose, everyone. We're about to copy off of corporate America's homework. Sorry to disappoint any of my conservative listeners, assuming I haven't scared you off already with my strong soy lib energy, but I don't think countries are like businesses. Governments and corporations are different entities designed to serve different interests using different methods. However, in this case, I do think we have something to learn from big companies. I just want to be clear that in taking inspiration from a certain practice some companies observe, I am not interested in the idea of let's run local government like a business. I just happen to think this particular practice is responsive to a set of problems that some businesses share with governments, and specifically directly democratic governments. Okay, so what is that similar set of problems? Let me start by discussing a little bit of background. Let's say you're a big company and you want to raise some money. You could go to the bank and get a loan. Alternatively, you could sell some stock. When you sell that stock, you're basically making people who buy it a deal. You say, hand me some money now so that I can make my company better. In exchange for that money, I'm going to make you a partial owner of my company. Each unit of partial ownership, or share, is going to entitle you to a certain amount of the company's profits going forward. The amount of profits you get is going to depend on how many shares you have. The more shares you have, the more of the profit I'll share with you via dividend. And in theory, this works out great for everyone. The company takes the money and spends it well to improve business. The improved business increases profit, and that increased profit gets sent back to the shareholders over time via dividends. However, for some people, the idea of buying a share and then letting the company just do whatever it wants with the money you use to pay for the share doesn't seem too great. Why should I hand over my money and then just trust you to do the right thing? Wouldn't it be better if I got a say in how the company was spending my money? That way, I can feel more confident that when I buy in by purchasing shares, that money will be used in ways that I agree with and think are a good idea. And if you don't give me that degree of say in exchange for my investment, well, maybe I'll just take my money elsewhere. So, companies in some instances might not be able to attract investment unless they agree to give shareholders some role in running the company. How do they do that? By having shareholder meetings where everyone who owns a share gets to vote on important corporate decisions. Okay, actually, a lot of shares are non voting, but pretend for the sake of this example that all the shares of this hypothetical company are voting shares. Each share you own gives you one vote. This means that the people who have the most money get the most say, which would be profoundly undemocratic if this was a government we were talking about, but this is business, so things are a little different. Great, problem solved. People who buy shares get to play a role in running the business, so they can be confident their money gets spent in ways that they agree with, etc., etc. Here's the problem. Getting shareholders together when it's a small company with like 2 or 3 investors isn't that tough. Sit everybody in a room, hash stuff out, take some notes on what happened. But when it's a really big company, there might be a whole lot of voting shareholders, like way too many to fit into a room. How can you make shareholder voting work if you're Google and maybe hundreds or thousands of people have the right to cast a vote? How do you get around the severe practical problems that presents? Is this sounding a little bit familiar, a little bit like how do you get around the practical problems of a directly democratic local government where everybody has the right to vote? There's another dynamic that's at play in the corporate setting that's irrelevant for the one person, one vote direct democracy I suggest implementing in local government, but even though it's irrelevant, we're in the neighborhood anyway, and I think it's interesting, so I'm going to talk about it. In practice, there's oftentimes like 2 or 3 big investors that own a ton of a company's stock. This means that these dudes are almost always going to win out over the horde of other plebeians who aren't big money billionaires and maybe own, say, 10 shares. Now, the plebeians aren't stupid. They know they won't individually be able to cast in a vote to make any significant difference. But what if they banded together? There's a huge number of people all over the world or all over the country who all own, 5 shares here, 10 shares there, and they all got together and acted collectively to vote in ways that they all agreed on, then maybe their votes combined could start to have a little more weight. But how do you organize thousands of people from across the country, or maybe even the world? Sounds pretty tough. Another problem, if not enough people show up, you might not have quorum, and you won't be able to act on all the important topics up for vote at a corporate meeting. Okay, so we've got these dynamics. 1, big companies need to figure out how to deal with the pragmatic hurdles of getting tons of shareholders to cast votes during shareholder meetings. 2, smaller shareholders need to figure out how to act in concert and be the David to the billionaire Goliaths. The way these 2 dynamics end up getting resolved is through the proxy system. Now, it's my understanding that proxy matters are one of the most complicated parts of corporate governance, so I'm going to have to fudge some of the details here as a non-expert, but here, at least to my understanding, is the basic concept. Sometime before an upcoming shareholders meeting, shareholders receive this big packet of information called a proxy statement. This packet has everything that's going to be voted on in the upcoming meeting. Based on that information, shareholders can decide how they're going to vote. If they can't be there in person, or if there's a campaign to have small-time investors band together and vote on a certain issue, the shareholders can request forms that allow them to designate another shareholder or a company agent as a proxy. This proxy will then vote on behalf of all the shareholders who delegated their vote to the proxy, and the proxy's vote will count as being equal to the votes of all the shareholders who selected the proxy. Thus, thousands of people scattered across the country can make their voices heard without having to hop on a plane to Delaware or whatever. The company doesn't have to figure out how the hell to build a physical meeting place or internet Zoom call that can handle all the shareholders showing up at once. Smaller shareholders can unite with other small shareholders to have their votes still matter. So why have we gone down this icky little corporate path? It's not because I think the corporate proxy model is a perfect one-to-one with a potential solution for the problems of direct democracy. Getting to vote in a few shareholder meetings a year is a far cry from the accountability and agency that just public governance demands. Most obviously, saying that you get more of a vote just because you have more money is profoundly undemocratic, and any just direct democracy must be based on a one-person, one-vote principle that doesn't care at all about how much money you have. All these factors are why I'm proposing big differences in the proxy system for proxy-based direct democracy as compared to corporate proxy voting. Namely, every person in proxy-based direct democracy gets one vote, and they can assign or withdraw proxy authority at any time within practicable reason. I add this practicability requirement, which, to be clear, would be very slippery to implement, because it may make sense to put some small procedural limit on assigning or withdrawing proxy authority to prevent record-keeping problems. For example, making it so that community members' proxy designations or withdrawals take 1 week to go into effect, or you can't withdraw proxy authority at the last minute when a town hall meeting is actually being held. However, a sufficiently well-managed proxy system may obviate the need for these kinds of safeguards. Lastly, under proxy-based direct democracy, community members would get to vote on all legislative proposals during regular town hall sessions rather than just at, a couple sessions per year. Despite these differences, corporate proxy voting is relevant to our purposes for 2 reasons. First, to be clear, it's where I took inspiration for the proxy system underlying proxy-based direct democracy. Since corporate proxy voting is the inspiration, it would be deceptive to hide the ball and claim I wasn't aware of it. I wanted to be clear that I knew about corporate proxy voting and equally clear that while it provided the foundation for proxy-based direct democracy, I was going to depart from it in significant ways to make the proxy system for direct democracy more just. Hopefully I've succeeded in getting those points across. Second, and more importantly, this shows that proxy-based direct democracy is not just some theoretical utopian idea that's unachievable in practice. Something not so unlike it is being practiced in corporate boardrooms across America on almost any given day of the week. That's not to diminish the practical problems of proxy-based direct democracy. It would present serious record-keeping, accountability, security, legality, tallying, and other challenges that would impose significant burdens on local governments. The burden would only increase in places like big cities that have millions of citizens. But I'm confident that these are solvable problems if we are willing as communities to dedicate our precious time and money to them. After all, it's not like the apparatus to run local elections under a smaller Republican form of government isn't already burdensome and complicated. And technologies that weren't around in the time of Athens or James Madison now have the potential to make tracking proxy delegations and recording votes much simpler. An online portal that handled delegations and withdrawals seems like a tricky but not completely unreasonable way to make the proxy system simpler to implement, manage, and use. If a bunch of big companies that care only about doing things as cheaply as possible can do it, so can our local governments. And if they can do it, then my view is that they should do it. Small R Republican government and all its ills have done enough damage. Direct democracy is an idea whose time has come. One final note before we wrap up. Maybe you're on board with the localist idea of turning the pyramid of preemption upside down and devolving some amount of power to local governments, but think the idea of direct democracy, proxy or otherwise, is dumb at best and outright harmful at worst. Alternatively, maybe you like the idea of running things based on direct democracy, but are not on board with this crazy notion of making local governments the highest form of authority in America. You aren't going to hear me arguing against either of those perspectives. This is not a toe the party line, all or nothing kind of situation. I believe strongly that both devolution of power to local governments and reforming local governments to be proxy-based direct democracies would make America a better place, and my hope is to convince you to agree with me. But I also think that either of those steps would also individually be an improvement over the current system. I'd rather live in a small R Republican local government that has the ability to preempt state law than live in a local government under the current way things work. Similarly, I'd rather live in a proxy-based directly democratic local government that's still subject to Dillon's rule than live in a local government that still functions the way they do now. So if you're compelled to act, but your heart isn't in one of these halves of my localist program, don't fret. You're still very much a part of the localist movement. And that brings us to the close of today's show. Proxy-based direct democracy is what allows us to capture the benefits of direct democracy's responsiveness and closeness while mitigating its challenges to practicality. That's the Cliff's Notes on why I want to see if it can be implemented in local governments across America. However, there is, one teeny tiny little speed bump to the idea of proxy-based direct democracy that I haven't really brought up yet. It's nothing too major, the kind of thing that's definitely perfectly fine to just kind of slip in casually at the end here. See, the thing is, small d direct democracy may kind of sort of be completely illegal in America, as in straight up unconstitutional. There's a relatively lesser known part of the Constitution that's called the Guarantee Clause that on its face could pose a bit of a problem to localism's directly democratic ambitions. But for reasons I'll explain next episode, despite the words on the tin, the Guarantee Clause may not prove a barrier to achieving direct democracy at the local level. Maybe. Possibly. Hopefully? Tune in next time to find out why the Guarantee Clause creates headaches that hopefully the federal courts won't try to cure. If that sounds interesting, think about following us on Spotify. And feel free to shoot me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.